All right, we got Jim Hemphill back on the show, writer, director, filmmaker. It's good to have you here. Thank you so much for being back, Jim.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I'm glad we got a chance to catch up, and sounds like things are going good. I know you've made shorts, you've made feature, well, at least one, if not more, and you're working on another. So you've got a range of experience, and we really want to know what the best of the best practices are. So starting in pre-production, what do you do?
I guess, yeah, the most important part of pre-production is just finding the right people to work with, because I think, and certainly, it's a cliche to say, a lot of different directors will, talk about casting and they'll say, the casting is 70% or 80% or 90% making the movie. I mean, I don't know if I go that far, but certainly if you make the right choice with casting early on, it's going to save you a lot of trouble down the line. And if you make a wrong choice, you're probably going to be struggling with it the whole time. Um, it's kind of a tricky thing. I mean, what I've learned, and this kind of goes for every stage, goes for pre-production, production, and post-production, is you really have to trust your intuition. I mean, it's not entirely an intellectual process. It's sort of a hard thing in some ways to talk about this stuff because when I made this movie The Trouble with the Truth with John Shea and Leah Thompson, and that I'm going to sort of contradict myself a little bit here because on the one hand I think pre-production, um the more planning time you have, the more planning you can do, the better off you are. And yet on that movie it was a sort of a different situation. We didn't have as much pre-production time as I would have liked because there were a variety of circumstances where we had to start shooting by a certain day. I mean, basically, we raised the money according to a tax thing where the movie had to be done by the end of the year, and so we had to start shooting at a certain point. And i- on the one hand, uh, not really articulating this well, but on the one hand, you want as much prep time as you can get. On the other hand, if you wait until you are feel like you're completely ready, you will never make the movie, because you're never completely ready. There's never any unanswered questions. And so, in a way, there's something to be said for the way we were forced into doing it on Trouble with the Truth, which was have a start date and pick it and say this is your date, and you just make it happen. It's a little stressful to do it that way. In our case, we were about 3 or 4 days away from shooting, and we didn't have our male lead yet. And had John Shea not said yes a few days beforehand, I probably wouldn't be speaking so positively about the experience. The movie probably would have fallen apart and it wouldn't have gotten made. But there is like a certain degree to which you have to just commit to it and say pick the start date with no matter what you have and aim for that and get the train on the tracks. And then once you've done that, you really have to trust your gut and your intuition, in terms of picking your collaborators. Because I would say, for the most part on that movie, I was very, very lucky. I had some great collaborators. The cinematographer I had was incredible. Um, and actually, that's a perfect example, though, in terms of trusting your gut, is I met with a few different cinematographers, and there were ones that I met with who had maybe more impressive credits than the guy who ended up shooting it, or more bells and whistles in terms of equipment they owned that they could bring to the movie or things like that. But the DP that I went with, I just felt something. I felt like he understood the movie. I just felt like I had conversations with him, and I felt like he understood what the movie was supposed to be. And I just had this gut feeling he was the guy, and he was. And uh, on the other side of that, there was somebody else on the crew who I won't name, who I had sort of a bad feeling about right from the beginning. But I thought, well, maybe it'll work, whatever. And it didn't ever work, and they ended up getting replaced halfway through the shooting, which was a lot more difficult than if I had just said before we started, okay, this clearly is not a relationship that works. This isn't someone that I communicate with well.
Yeah, Jim, that's awesome. I mean, I think, we don't talk enough about the intuitive side of things. And so, what I heard that you stress was really, picking the collaborators that you jive with and then having a real intuitive sense and trusting that gut, as well as the huge value of casting. Um, and then I think, that kind of importance to have like a little push to get you just that start date, just get in there and get it done. I think all those are super important factors. I mean, I'm guilty, I went, years ago, I was very still, pretty insecure about, being a director. And I went in with a DP who had those bells and whistles, and it just, and they got replaced. And it was just a very heart-wrenching experience, to be quite honest. So it's like it's so important that communication that you have with somebody, and they just get your script, they get you, and they get the importance of collaboration, and working together.
Yeah, and it's interesting you bringing up insecurity because that's a tricky thing is, having insecurity as a director because I'm sure we may have even talked about this the last time we talked, but the strange thing about being a director is unless you are incredibly experienced, in a weird way, you're the least experienced person on the set because people who on the crew, an actor or a crew member, they might make several movies a year. If you're a director, you're doing one, if you're lucky, you're doing one every couple of years, probably not even that these days. So everyone there has more experience than you. And on the one hand, you have to figure out how to utilize that experience. But on the other hand, it has to be your movie and it has to filter, everything has to filter through you. And I find that balance is really tricky because it's very easy to get insecure and think, if you want to aim the camera this way and the DP is saying to do it in the opposite direction, and you think, well, this DP, he's done 40 movies or something. I've done two. Maybe he knows what he's doing, and it's very tricky. And sometimes they might be right. So that's the trickiest part of all this intuition thing is that you have to trust your intuition, but you also have to know when someone else has a better idea.
Yeah, well, and that's sort of, I think, the $1 million kind of, um, formula is really saying, all right, you know, in Buddhism, there's that concept of beginner's mind, and coming into it fresh allows you to not get kind of sidetracked by all the other things that you may be aware of after repetition of, you know, for example, meditation or something like that. So that fresh beginner's mind can add something, a lot to the artistry of what you're doing and the intuition as well. So I think it's, how does a director come in feeling confident that they have the vision, they have the toolkit that they're responsible for bringing, and they also have the communication and collaboration skills to work with someone, and they can play that give and take game. And when it is time to say, I really feel strongly it's got to be like this. Can we, please try that? To be able to do that in a way that doesn't challenge or confront, seem confrontational, where somebody's going to be like, whoa, their egos are going to get flared and rebel. So if you got a, tactic you can share there, that'd be great.
Yeah, I mean that it's tricky. I mean, I think that to me, the overall thing again for all this it's funny to break it into pre-production, production, and post-production because in a weird way to me it's all sort of the same continuum. I don't necessarily separate them in my mind that much, and I think the important thing across all of them is to really if in my experience, and again the thing I also always want to say is that there's obviously no one way of doing this. Like everybody does it differently. It's kind of the fun thing about directing movies is that there's so many different ways to approach every aspect and everybody has a different approach. And all I can say is what has worked for me is I find that you just want to make sure everybody if you make sure everybody feels listened to, you will generally get the best out of them. That doesn't mean you have to take every suggestion they make or everything like that. But I know and and also, I mean, I find that if something doesn't really matter, um, let them have their way. Like, for example, with my actors, if if I had the idea that I wanted one of them to be on one side of the table and the other one on the other side, and they said, "Oh, we're more comfortable switching sides," well, that doesn't really matter to me. So there's not really a point in fighting it. And when you let them have the things that don't matter, and also when you make them feel they're listened to, then when there is a place where you don't agree with them, they're more prone to go along with it without, that's what happened with my actors. There was a point where John did want to do something that I thought just didn't really make sense in terms of how he wanted to move and where he wanted to be. And when I said, I don't know, that looks funny to me, he looked at Leah and he said, "Well, this guy's he's listened to everything else we said, so I guess maybe, maybe he's right." Let's but I think it's really just, the key is not making anybody feel like they're being shut down. The more they feel like they're contributing, the more they will want to do for you and the less they'll want to fight you. And again, sometimes it's easier said than done if somebody has a bunch of terrible ideas they keep throwing at you. But usually, I mean, again, usually that's not the case if you've sort of trusted your gut and chosen people that you feel a connection with. So yeah, I just think, and again, there are other directors who treat it differently. There are all the stories we've heard about directors who treat filmmaking like combat or something and are very confrontational. And that's just not the way I like to do it. I feel like I feel like you catch more flies with honey, as they say. I think you kind of, just make everybody comfortable and everybody feel like they're contributing, and that's how you kind of get the best.
Yeah, I think that's the healthiest approach. And in the end, you're likely to get a better outcome, if not the same. I remember, this same experience that I mentioned earlier. It was, I don't know if it was just kind of in my mindset. I'm sure it came from a place of insecurity. It was my biggest production I've ever done. And I was just like, it's war, do or die. And the set or the cast was all right. The crew couldn't stand me. And you know, the movie ended up being great. I was really happy with the movie. But it didn't need to go down like that. I think that's the biggest lesson. It didn't need to go down that way. And it could have been a much healthier process. And I learned from that. And the other, opportunities that I had directing were markedly changed because of that experience and just how emotionally grueling it was for myself. And it's not necessary. So what before we switch on to production, um, what are the tools that you like to use in pre-production? Do you go into production with a shot list? Do you have storyboards? Do you have some sort of director's diagrams that you use?
It depends on the movie and even on the scene. I mean, I've directed 2 features, and the first one I did was a super, super low budget horror movie, and for that one, I did a little bit more planning in terms of my shots. I did some very rudimentary storyboards. I'm a terrible drawer, so it's very much like just stick figures and things like that. For that movie, I went in for a lot of it with the shots kind of planned out because I think if you're doing horror or suspense or something like that, there needs to be a little bit more precision in terms of how you're building things and structuring things. When I did Trouble with the Truth, which was essentially a romantic dramedy, I didn't do any of that. Basically, my attitude was the actors are going to kind of dictate the visual style, and so with Trouble with the Truth, I would get there in the morning. It was a very simple movie in a lot of ways, and it was written to be that way because when I made Bad Reputation, my horror movie, I felt like one of the shortcomings of that movie is that my ambitions so far outstripped my resources. I was trying to make a $4 million Blumhouse movie with a $10,000 budget, and so that movie was very ragged because I just was always trying to do more than I really had the resources for. So for Trouble with the Truth, I kind of went in the opposite direction. I wrote something that I knew was simple enough that even if I didn't have a lot of money, as long as I had a couple good actors, I would have a movie. And so that one was designed to be very, very simple and easy, and it kind of was. I mean, basically, on Trouble with the Truth, I would just get there every morning, a couple hours before everybody else. Me and my DP and AD would just look over the pages that were going to get shot that day, and we'd come up with a kind of general plan for how we were going to shoot it. And then when the actors got there and we rehearsed, if we had to make adjustments based on what they did, we would. But that one we kind of just did as we went. There wasn't, I didn't, and truthfully, I have to say it was a much more pleasant experience because I think on Bad Reputation, I mean, I think again it was good to plan, but I also think on that because it was my first movie, I was a little too tight in terms of not um, letting go of the plan if other possibilities arose. I think with Bad Reputation, it was like I saw the movie in my mind and I was constantly frustrated that I wasn't getting the movie that was in my mind. And I would have been better off shooting the movie that was in front of me. And, if we got a location that wasn't exact, didn't match what I had originally envisioned, being a little bit more flexible instead of trying to shoehorn everything into what my original plan was. But I think, again, I think it depends kind of on the movie. Certainly, if you're doing something, I've never done anything that involved extensive, visual effects or stunts, but there you have to plan stuff out a lot more so that everybody knows what page you're on and everything. But yeah, I just think it just kind of depends. And if I'm doing a simple dialogue scene that doesn't have a lot of visual pyrotechnics or something, I don't really need to plan that ahead. That's something I can just kind of look at the actors on the day and know where to put the camera.
I really like the line shooting what's in front of me, and being there as well. It's so important to capture the now of what's happening. Jim, how do you like to communicate and adjust your actors in production? And how extensively would you ideally like to have had rehearsals?
It's sorry, I don't know how I got muted there. Um, it's funny because, I've never really had rehearsal time on either of the movies I did, and yet I would love to have it. I think it would be, I mean, um, the first movie I did was just complete, you know, scrambling and run and gun, and then with Trouble with the Truth, because John got cast so late in the day, there was really no our entire rehearsal. Well, here's the interesting thing about Trouble with the Truth. I guess in a way, it's lying to say we had no rehearsal. We didn't have any rehearsal ahead of shooting the movie, but we shot the movie in kind of an unusual way, which is that every day John and Leah and I would rehearse before we would shoot, and we would sometimes take several hours rehearsing. And the crew would be waiting, like, what are these people doing? And we would take several hours. There were days when we didn't do our first shot until noon because we rehearsed all morning. However, after doing that rehearsal, we could sometimes bang out the whole day's. We would sometimes that be done by 4. We would shoot everything we needed for because after that rehearsal, they could just do it. And I think again, it's I think it depends on the actor. I mean, I think if some actors love rehearsal, some don't. Um, and so I think when you're working with an actor, you sort of have to talk with them in the early stages and just ask them, what do you like? How do you like to work? Some of them like you to talk to them a lot. Some don't like you to talk to them at all. The place where you can get into difficulty is if you have two actors and one loves to rehearse and one hates it, then I'm not sure exactly how you reconcile that. I mean, luckily I've haven't really run into that problem yet. But yeah, it's very again, this is very it's very tricky to talk about some of this stuff because I do feel like it's so intuitive and there are no rules, and I do think it's just an actor by actor basis, and it does, and for example, on Trouble with the Truth, John Shea and Leah Thompson, they're both great, and I think one of the reasons the movie worked is that they both have kind of different energies and different styles that worked well together. But John comes at it from a very academic background. I mean, he went to, I think, like, Yale Drama School or something, and has done tons of theater. And I mean, Leah's done some theater too, but she comes at it from a more instinctive place. And John is the kind of guy, if his character makes references to books he's reading, he wants to know what those books are. Like, he wants me to give him those books to, if not read entirely, at least look at and know what they are. And Leah's sort of pulling it more out from inside of herself. And you just kind of have to figure out what each actor is like, and how they like to communicate. So to answer your question, how I like to communicate with actors, it's basically however they want to be communicated with.
Yeah. And I think that's, a starting point is know your actor and know how they work, and then how can you best support them in the process. In terms of post production, I mean, here we are. We've got a ton of footage. You're starting all over again. It can be a very daunting experience, especially in those initial days when you don't have that first rough cut. What do you suggest? How do you approach it?
Um, I mean, that's an interesting question too, because I did my 2 movies totally differently. The first movie I edited myself just out of necessity, and then the second movie I had an editor. And my first movie, I don't know, I don't know that my first movie is entirely something that can be replicated. I mean, I guess it depends on how you're doing it. But basically, the way my first movie was made, we were, shot it for no money. So we basically shot it over the course of a summer whenever the actors were available. So I would shoot a couple days and then there might be 4 days off. And then we'd shoot a couple days and then there might be a week off and whatever. We shot, I think the total shooting days were something like probably 22 or 23. But they were spread out over the course of about 4 months. And that actually worked out really well for me editing my own footage because it meant that I could kind of be looking at stuff as I went. It wasn't like I just suddenly had this big dump of footage that I had to sift through. I would have a couple days worth that I could kind of go through until I waited for the next time I was shooting. And so I didn't have that thing you're talking about on that movie of being overwhelmed by it. Um, and I also didn't have that on Trouble with the Truth because on that one, it was sort of the opposite experience. I just handed the stuff over and I basically said to the editor, like, I don't want to look at it until you've got a rough cut. Like, I let him do the first cut. And then I figured, and that worked out great because his instincts were good. And then once I saw his rough cut, then we were able to fine tune it. And I know a lot of directors like to be in the editing room with the editor the whole time and looking over their shoulder. I find that for me, I think if my first movie I think it worked out okay, me editing it, but I do think that the second one was better because I was able to come to it fresher, having not not looking at all of the footage constantly. And also, I think the problem with looking at all the footage all the time is you lose your objectivity because, like I think sometimes you fall in love with something because you know how hard it was to get the shot that day or something, and maybe that shot doesn't belong in the movie, but you don't want to let it go because that problem happened with me with Bad Reputation. That it had an ending that didn't really work, but that ending was the hardest thing to shoot for the entire movie. It was the hardest location to get. It was a total pain. So I just would not let it go until the last possible minute. I acknowledge that this wasn't working. Whereas if you have an editor who's working a little bit outside of you and you just say, show me what you think is the best movie, he or she might cut something out and you won't even notice it's missing when you come back at it fresh to look at it. And so yeah, so I kind of find for me, if you have an editor who you trust, again, much like with actors or anybody else, if you kind of let them have a certain amount of freedom, um, they will hopefully find things that, you didn't think of or whatever. Like I would be very surprised sometimes by the line readings my editor would choose that he thought were the best ones by the actors. And sometimes I would disagree and we'd put in a different take back in, but there are some that we left in that initially I thought were strange choices that now I look at the movie and I think actually really work and are sort of, he was right. They're more naturalistic, they're more realistic. But again, I was married in my mind to this kind of picture I had when I wrote the script of what it was supposed to sound like. And he was responding just to like what works, what's best, what are the actors doing that's best.
Yeah. Have an unbiased collaborator there to get you over that last mile.
Yeah. So
Jim Hemphill, writer, director. Any parting words, you think young filmmakers really could?
I have one last tip, which is going to sound silly and very simple, but I
Yeah.
have found that it is extremely important, which is if you want your crew to be on your side, really do your best. It sounds obvious and simple, but not everybody does it, and it's very important. Do your best to learn everyone's names as fast as you can. If you're on a movie where, like, my first movie had no crew, so it wasn't a problem. But when I did Trouble with the Truth, I had a crew of maybe, I don't know, 30 people or something, which to me felt like huge. I mean, that was a huge, a lot of people. Um, but if you learn the PA's name, if you learn the grip's name, if you learn the dolly grip's name, a simple thing like coming in the morning and saying, "Hi, Sarah. Hi, Joe," whatever, you would not believe how far it goes. And they will, because as long as they feel seen, as long as they feel like they're recognized, they know that what they're doing is important. Even if it's somebody who, on a typical movie, if you're doing a movie like Trouble with the Truth, where you have those 30 people, um, you don't necessarily have a reason to communicate with the dolly grip. The DP is probably going to do that or something. But just saying hi to them in the morning by name, uh, again, just it goes a long way and it will get them on your side. And you don't want a crew to not be on your side, because if the crew is not on your side, you have a
Got
very
nothing.
difficult shoot. And that can happen too if they feel like they're not respected or not, then they can churn on you very fast, and you definitely don't want that.
Jim, words of wisdom. That's awesome. I love that. It's super important. Thank you so much. It's great to see you. I really appreciate you being here and sharing your experience with us. And I look forward to more and the next feature.
Thanks. Well, this has been great. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks, Jim. All right. Take
All right.
care. Bye
Bye-bye.
bye.